Do you believe that in modern America there once existed a place where meat fell from the sky, where women wearing swimsuits sometimes had to be escorted by police when going out in public, and where an entire city casually lived inside the mouth of a meteor crater for hundreds of years without much concern? Welcome to Kentucky, a place where the boundary between the absurd and the ordinary is nearly erased. To outsiders, this is a land of stories that sound completely fabricated. A half-man, half-goat, creature lurking beneath a railroad bridge, laws banning people from carrying ice cream in their pockets, or political oaths that seem as if they stepped straight out of the 18th century. But to the locals, all of it is simply everyday life. So what turned Kentucky into a place where eccentricity became the norm? And why do these hard-to-believe stories continue to exist to this day? Number 1. When the sky rained meat. That morning in Bathe County, Kentucky, the sky was clear. No clouds, no wind, no signs of disaster or unusual weather. Yet within just a few minutes in March 1876, the sky above Olympia Springs did something that science to this day has never been able to fully explain. It showered the ground with countless pieces of bright red meat. Mrs. Allen Crouch, a typical farm woman, was standing on her porch cooking soup when she heard strange thud sounds. At first she thought birds were falling or tree branches snapping, but when she looked up, what was falling had no wings, no feathers, no visible bones. It was meat. Pieces of various sizes, some several centimeters long, rained down across the yard, rooftops, fences, and even covered the walkway. Witnesses later recalled that there was so much meat it took an entire horse-drawn wagon to collect it all. In less than 10 minutes, the entire neighborhood descended into chaos. People ran out of their houses, no one understanding what was happening. It wasn't raining. There was no storm. There were no airplanes. At that time, aircraft did not even exist as a common means of transportation. And most importantly, there was no visible source in the sky from which the meat could have come. What was even more unsettling was this: the meat was still fresh. Some people, true to the instincts of the 19th century, actually tasted it. Some said it resembled venison, others claimed it tasted like mutton. Samples were later sent for analysis, and reports from that era noted that the muscle fiber structure indicated it was mammalian muscle tissue, not fish, not bird. Almost immediately, a flood of theories emerged. The most common suggested that a flock of vultures flying overhead had simultaneously vomited partially digested meat, a survival reflex when threatened. But the problem was this: to produce such a massive quantity of meat, dozens of vultures would have had to vomit at the same moment over the exact same location, without anyone seeing a single bird in the sky. There was no evidence, no witnesses. Another theory went even further. Professor Kurt Godey of Transylvania University, Lexington, later recalled that at the time some people seriously proposed the possibility that an extraterrestrial object had exploded in the atmosphere, and the biological fragments were what remained. It sounded absurd, but no other explanation proved more convincing. The strangest part lies here. Bathe County did not try to forget the incident. On the contrary, they remembered it. They retold it. They passed it down through generations. Years later, the area even hosted a Kentucky Meat Shower Festival, displaying photographs, documents, and even recreating a dish known as mysterious meat chili for visitors. To the rest of the world, this remains one of the most absurd phenomena in American history. But to the people of Kentucky, it was simply a strange morning in 1876 when the sky did something it shouldn't have done. And then life went on as if nothing had happened. Number two, the alien encounter in Hopkinsville, 1955. If the meat rain of 1876 made people in Kentucky believe that the sky was capable of the most insane acts, then the night of August 21st into the early hours of August 22nd, 1955, in rural Hopkinsville planted a different kind of fear. The sky didn't just drop objects, it could drop beings. Around 7 p.m. at a remote farmhouse near the village of Kelly, the Sutton Langford family, 5 adults and 7 children, were going about their evening as usual when Billy Ray Taylor, a man in the household, ran in from the well with a pale face. He swore he had just seen a bright, disc-shaped object streak across the sky and descend into the woods behind the house. Before anyone could process what he was saying, the dog in the yard began howling violently. A few minutes later, it appeared. According to the witnesses, from the darkness around the house emerged small beings about 90 to 120 centimeters tall, with slender bodies, bluish or silvery skin, abnormally large heads, and glowing eyes. They began peering in through the windows. When one of them moved close to the glass, the Sutton family opened fire. Gunshots rang out. The creature fell, then stood back up and drifted into the darkness, as if gravity had no effect on it. For nearly 4 hours, the farmhouse became a fortress. The adults took turns standing guard, firing at shadowy figures appearing on the roof, behind fences, and in the trees. Bullets riddled the wooden walls. Children hid under beds. No one dared take their eyes off the windows. What terrified them most was not being attacked, but the fact that those things seemed impossible to kill. Around midnight, the family packed the children into their car and sped straight to the Hopkinsville police station. In a panic, they reported that a tribe of extraterrestrial creatures was surrounding their home. The report was serious enough that local police, state troopers, firefighters, and even reserve military personnel were mobilized that very night. When authorities arrived at the farm, there were no creatures. Only spent shell casings scattered across the yard, shattered windows, bullet holes in the walls, and the absolute silence of the surrounding woods. No footprints, no bodies, no strange signals. The case was later forwarded to the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book and classified as insufficient evidence, likely a misidentification. Scientists suggested that the Sutton family may have mistaken large owls, animals with reflective eyes under light and shapes that can cause nighttime illusions. But the problem was this: owls do not stand upright, do not float through the air, and do not appear simultaneously in multiple locations over the course of 4 consecutive hours. The Sutton family never retracted their testimony. They did not sell the story to Hollywood. They did not profit from the notoriety. They simply continued living in Kentucky, a place where even today, many locals still recount the story in an eerily calm tone. Because in Hopkinsville, the night when those who came from the sky paid a visit is not remembered as a disaster. It is remembered simply as that night. Number 3. Banning ice cream in back pockets. After the night of encounters with beings not of this earth in Hopkinsville, Kentucky seemed to remind the rest of America that not every oddity comes from the sky. Some strange things come from your pockets. In the Kentucky State Code, there exists a provision that sounds like a joke. It is illegal to carry an ice cream cone in your back pocket. Not for hygiene reasons, not for food safety, but because if you lived in 19th century Kentucky, an ice cream cone could help you steal an entire horse. At the time, Kentucky was farm country and horses were major assets, sometimes more valuable than cash. But theft laws had a deadly loophole. If a horse followed you voluntarily, it was not considered stolen. And there were people clever enough or devious enough to exploit that fact. The trick was frighteningly simple. A thief would take an ice cream cone and slip it upside down into a back pocket. The smell of sugar, milk, and baked dough drifted behind them. A horse, with a nose more sensitive than any device of that era, caught the familiar scent and curiously followed. No reins, no whip, no force, just an accidental stroll, ending in someone else's stable. By the time the owner realized what had happened, it was too late. Legally speaking, the horse had not been taken, it had merely followed, and the law at the time coldly sided with the trickster. The story spread quickly across Kentucky. Farmers were outraged, ranch owners cried foul, and then the state legislature decided to do something that still sounds absurd today: pass a law banning ice cream cones in pockets. It didn't matter whether you intended to eat it or not. It didn't matter whether the ice cream was still frozen or already melted. If you were found with an ice cream cone in your back pocket, you could be considered in violation of the law. The law existed to patch a legal loophole, But in doing so, it created one of the strangest statutes in America. And what is most striking is this: it is still written in the law books, not repealed, not amended, just quietly sitting there like a reminder that Kentucky once lived in an era when a dessert could undermine the very concept of justice. Today, Kentuckians tell this story with a half smile. They say that if you were a Western cowboy faced with the ice cream cone trick, the best thing to do would be to dismount and bow. To them, it is not a legal embarrassment, but proof of a wild era in which people had to invent strange rules to counter even stranger schemes. And like so many things in Kentucky, the ban on ice cream in pockets sounds absurd, but in local eyes, it is just an old story, an ordinary story in a place where ordinary has always been just a little bit wrong. Number 4, you must stop your vehicle to hunt. Whales. Another provision in the state code clearly states hunting while operating a vehicle is prohibited, whether you are in a car, a truck, a motorcycle, or even a helicopter. If you spot deer, elk, or any kind of wildlife in the fields, you must bring the vehicle to a complete stop before pulling the trigger. From a safety standpoint, this sounds reasonable. The problem lies in the sentence that follows. The law states, quite seriously, that this regulation does not apply to whales. Yes, whales. Which means that according to the literal legal wording, if you are moving and shooting a whale, Kentucky law would simply look the other way. To outsiders, this usually provokes laughter because everyone knows an obvious truth. Kentucky has no ocean, no saltwater lakes, no bays, and no whales have appeared here since the Devonian period, more than 4 million years ago, when this region was still submerged beneath an ancient sea. So why do whales appear in the hunting laws of a landlocked state? There is no official explanation. Some scholars suggest it was an error copied from federal regulations, where whales are classified under a separate set of rules. Others believe it was a subtle piece of satire by early lawmakers, a way of saying the only thing you're allowed to shoot while driving is something that will never exist here. Whatever the reason, the result is unmistakably Kentucky, a law written with a straight face, but whose content sounds like it stepped out of a fairy tale. Locals recount this story with a knowing smile. To them, it isn't a mistake, it's character. Kentucky was once a hunting land, where guns and dirt roads crossed paths every day. The law had to prevent people from firing recklessly from moving vehicles, but in doing so, it accidentally left behind a line that has puzzled generations ever since. And so, amid rolling green hills and quiet farms, there exists a hard-to-believe truth. Legally speaking, whales are the only creatures that may be hunted while in motion in Kentucky. No one believes it will ever happen. But in Kentucky, the law doesn't have to make sense. It only has to exist. Number 5. The Pope, Lick Monster, the goat man killer beneath the railway bridge. If the whale hunting law makes people laugh at the legalization of absurdity, the Pope Lick Monster is the kind of story that causes smiles to fade very quickly. Because in Louisville, this legend does not live only in words, it is tied to real deaths. The railway bridge spanning Pope Lick Creek looks no different from hundreds of other iron bridges in Kentucky. Old, rusted, dozens of meters high, and meant solely for trains. But when night falls, the place becomes a blurred boundary between reality and nightmare. Locals say that what lives beneath the bridge is neither human nor fully beast. It is tall, gaunt, with the legs of a goat, and the head of a man, or the other way around, depending on who is telling the story. The only thing everyone agrees on, no one ever sees it clearly the same way twice. The Pope Lick Monster does not chase its prey. It doesn't need to. According to legend, it hypnotizes. On foggy nights, when visibility shrinks to just a few meters, people hear strange sounds. Not quite crying, not quite whistling. A long, steady noise, as if calling someone closer. Curious young people step onto the bridge, believing they are about to encounter something extraordinary. And then the only thing they encounter is an oncoming train at a speed impossible to escape. In 1988, Jack J.C. Baum, just 17 years old, climbed onto the bridge at night with two friends. When the train appeared, there was nowhere to run. Jack was killed instantly. The other two survived, but carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. 6 years later, in 1994, another accident occurred nearby when a motorcyclist lost control in the bridge area. In the years that followed, the list of victims quietly grew, not because the monster killed directly, but because it led people to a place with no way back. Authorities and police have always insisted there is no monster, only a high bridge, fast train, and reckless decisions. But the people of Louisville understand one thing better than anyone else. If there were no Pope Lick monster, why would people keep going there? Today, the Pope Lick Bridge is closed to the public, fences erected, warning signs posted everywhere. But legends cannot be fenced off. It lives on in late-night stories, in whispered warnings to children, in the chill that runs down your spine when you drive past as the fog settles in. To outsiders, the Pope Lick monster is an urban legend. To people in Kentucky, it is a simple reminder. Some places are not dangerous because monsters live there, but because humans were never meant to set foot there. Number 6. A woman in a bikini. Had to be escorted by police. After chilling legends and laws that sound like jokes, Kentucky once again confounds outsiders with another reality. There was a time when a woman's body was measured by weight in the eyes of the law. For many years, Kentucky had a regulation that makes anyone reading it pause and read it again just to be sure they understood correctly. According to this rule, women appearing on highways in bikinis, not at beaches, not at swimming pools, would be considered in violation of the law unless they met one of two very scientific conditions. Either they were accompanied by a police officer or a bodyguard, or they did not fall within the weight range of 90 to 199 pounds, approximately 40 to 90 kilograms. In other words, if you had a normal body by social standards, you were not allowed to walk alone in a bikini. But if you were extremely thin or very heavy, the law simply did not apply. No explanation, no additional exceptions, just dry numbers sitting quietly in legal text. To outsiders, this was a joke. To Kentuckians, it was part of a strange memory from a time when the law believed it was protecting public morality. According to local records, the original intention was to prevent excessive exposure of the body that might disturb public order on the streets. But tying that idea to specific body weight quickly turned the regulation into an object of ridicule. Kentuckians retell the story with a very characteristic sense of humor. They say that if you weighed 200 pounds or more, you could confidently walk down the street in a bikini without any protection. But if you weighed 199 pounds, you should probably call the police first, not because it was dangerous, but because the law required it. What matters is this: the law was not a myth. It truly existed, cited in collections of bizarre but legal statutes, and was only repealed relatively recently. No one remembers exactly how many cases it was ever enforced in, but the fact that it sat there, among thousands of other laws, is enough to say a great deal about the thinking of that era. Today, no one is fined for walking along Kentucky roads in a bikini. But the story is still told, like an old anecdote that is both funny and hard to believe. To locals, it is not an embarrassment of the past, but yet another piece of evidence of a simple truth. In Kentucky, the most absurd things you hear were sometimes perfectly ordinary laws. Number 7. The Cursed Chest, the Death Coffin of Frankfort. At the Kentucky History Museum in Frankfort, there is an artifact that makes many visitors hesitate the moment they read its placard: the Conjured Chest. At first glance, it appears to be nothing more than an ordinary 19th century wooden cabinet, but the history attached to it is anything but ordinary. According to legend, sometime in the 830s, a slave owner named Jeremiah Graham forced one of his enslaved men, Remus, to build the chest. Remus labored without pay, and after finishing the work, he was beaten to death. His death did not end the story. It became the beginning of the curse. Other enslaved people, filled with anger and helplessness, performed an ancient African ritual. They sprinkled owl blood inside the chest and pronounced a curse. Whoever used it would suffer misfortune. The first to pay the price was Jeremiah's infant son, who died shortly after being placed inside the chest. Later, his grandson died at the age of 21, followed by other members of the Graham family who fell seriously ill or died prematurely under mysterious circumstances. The rumors spread beyond the family. A curious neighbor once borrowed the chest to store hunting equipment. Less than a year after World War II, his gun suddenly discharged, killing its owner. In 1946, a woman invited to lift the curse on the chest also died suddenly after performing the ritual. According to family records and local documents, at least 16 to 17 people are believed to have died in connection with the chest. From that point on, no one dared place anything inside it. The chest was eventually transferred to the museum with a dried owl's wing placed in the top drawer, a silent warning. To people in Kentucky, this is not just a ghost story. It is a memory of slavery, violence, and the belief that some objects carry the resentment of human suffering within them. Number 8. Buying a hat required. The husband's signature. In 1922, in the city of Owensboro in western Kentucky, a law was enacted with such solemn seriousness that rereading it today still feels unbelievable. Married women were not allowed to buy a new hat without their husband's permission, not borrowing money, not buying a house, just a hat. At the time, a hat was not merely an accessory. It was a symbol of status, propriety, and a woman's respectability. And to the lawmakers of Owensboro, the right to decide such matters did not belong to the woman who wore the hat, but to the man of the household. The law was introduced with what seemed like a very reasonable justification for the early 20th century, to prevent wasteful spending and to preserve domestic order. Local folklore in Owensboro still passes down a familiar scene: wives pedaling their bicycles along the street, spotting a lovely hat in a shop window, stepping inside with eager eyes, then suddenly stopping short. The shopkeeper would quietly ask, "Do you have your husband's written consent?" If not, the only options were to turn the bicycle around and go home, or to call the husband to bring the money, along with his approval. To Kentuckians of that era, this was not particularly strange. Women managed the household, men controlled the purse strings, a social order considered natural. But to outsiders, the story sounds like a form of bureaucratic procedure imposed on marriage itself. Buying a hat felt like filing paperwork for property ownership. The law gradually became obsolete as society changed and eventually faded into obscurity without any dramatic repeal. Today, very few people in Owensboro even remember that it ever existed. But when it is mentioned, young Kentuckians can only laugh. A time when women's fashion had to wait for a man's signature. Number 9. Bringing snakes into church is forbidden. The Appalachian region has long been known for its insular religious communities, where the Bible is interpreted literally. Among them exists an extreme belief known as snake handling. Followers believe that if their faith is strong enough, they can hold venomous snakes without being bitten as proof of God's protection. Such rituals once took place inside churches themselves, amid hymns and wooden boxes containing cobras and rattlesnakes. Kentucky, having witnessed too many fatal accidents resulting from this belief, chose to draw a line through legislation. Statute KRS 437.060 was enacted, stating bluntly the use, display, or bringing of any reptile into a religious service is prohibited without exception. Snakes, lizards, alligators, turtles, all are strictly banned. Violators may be fined between $50 and $100, a significant sum at the time the law was passed. To outsiders, it is hard to believe that a modern society would need a law simply to prevent people from bringing snakes to church. But to Kentuckians, it makes perfect sense. In Appalachia, preachers delivering sermons with venomous snakes coiled around their arms were once not uncommon, and every death caused by a snake bite left behind questions that faith alone could not answer. Today, Kentuckians recount this law with a half-joking, half-serious tone. Some say that if someone brings a snake to the pulpit, that person is breaking the law, not praying. Others joke that police could arrest such a preacher with the same attitude as issuing a traffic ticket. The law is not meant to mock religion. It exists to protect human life, something even the strongest faith cannot replace. But the very fact that it had to exist says much about Kentucky, a place where the line between the sacred and the dangerous was once so thin it had to be written into law. And like many things here, banning snakes from church sounds strange. But to people in Kentucky, it is simply a necessary rule, in a land where belief was once strong enough to challenge even venom. Number 10. Intimacy on a motorcycle seat is prohibited. In London, Kentucky, a small town nestled in the hills, there exists a regulation that sounds like a joke, yet is fully documented. Engaging in sexual activity on the seat of a motorcycle while the vehicle is parked is prohibited. What shocks people is not the ban itself, but the exception. According to the wording of the law, if the motorcycle is moving, the act is not addressed. In other words, in strictly legal terms, the issue is not the act, but whether the vehicle is stationary or not. The local blog Kentucky for Kentucky once mocked the rule, saying, "The simplest way not to get arrested is to go inside. Otherwise, the law doesn't say anything about doing it on a moving bike." That half-joking remark quickly spread across the state, turning the statute into a well-known anecdote. No one knows exactly what prompted the local council to write this regulation in the first place. Some speculate it was a response to a specific incident that disrupted public order. Others believe it was drafted during a period of intense moral conservatism when any behavior deemed out of place had to be fenced off with legal language. But once words are put into law, strange loopholes inevitably appear. Residents of London recount the story with evident amusement. Children burst into laughter at the sheer absurdity. Adults shake their heads, half embarrassed, half entertained. Local police rarely, if ever, enforce the rule, but its mere existence has been enough to turn it into legend. What matters is this: the law is not meant to encourage or describe anything explicit. It simply reveals a very Kentucky truth. Laws are sometimes written to deal with situations the lawmakers never imagined would be examined this closely. Number 11. Dogs are not allowed to touch cars. If in earlier stories Kentucky law stepped in to deal with monsters, venomous snakes, or even people's private lives, here the story takes an even more unexpected turn. This time, dogs are written into the law. In Fort Thomas, a quiet town near Cincinnati, there exists a local regulation that sounds like a joke at first glance. Dogs are not permitted to bite, provoke, or interfere with automobiles, not moving vehicles, not traffic accidents, but cars that are parked perfectly still. The legal text does not clearly define what interfere with means, but locals explain it vividly. The story began with a dog that was perhaps a little too conscientious. It viewed unfamiliar cars parked in front of the house as potential threats. It barked, lunged, it scratched at car doors, and even bit tires as if carrying out a neighborhood watch duty. At first, people found it amusing, but when the scene repeated itself, startled drivers, scratched paint, arguments breaking out, the authorities realized they had to do the most familiar thing in Kentucky: write a law. So instead of punishing the dog, the regulation targeted the owner. If your pet harasses a car, even if it only scratches or barks close to the window, you could be considered in violation of local rules. In theory, police have the authority to intervene because a dog has shown a lack of respect for an automobile. To outsiders, this usually provokes laughter, but people in Fort Thomas recount the story with complete calm. To them, it isn't a foolish law. It's a solution to a very real problem, Kentucky style. No long debates, no canine psychology, just put it into the law and be done with it. Some even joke that in Fort Thomas, if you see a dog barking at a car instead of chasing it away, you should call the police because it might be violating traffic regulations. Of course, things rarely escalate that far, but the mere existence of the rule is enough to turn it into a local anecdote. In Kentucky, even pets have to learn how to live with the law. And sometimes that leads to regulations which, once read aloud, make it perfectly clear why this place is so often described as a land where the bizarre is treated as everyday life. Number 12. Throwing eggs and tomatoes at speakers is prohibited. When dogs were already forbidden from offending automobiles, Kentucky went on to prove that even human outrage sometimes needs to be restrained by law. And occasionally what requires control is not speech, but what gets thrown from the crowd. In outdoor speeches of past centuries, when public squares served as arenas for political and religious debate, Kentucky quickly recognized a familiar problem. Not everyone objected with polite words. Some people carried rotten eggs, others hid tomatoes in their pockets. And when a speech strayed from expectations, the podium suddenly became a target. So a law was enacted very straightforward in its wording. It is forbidden to throw eggs or tomatoes at a speaker during outdoor talks. Motive does not matter. Whether you oppose or support the speaker is irrelevant. If the act occurs, you may be fined or even face jail time. In theory, this is a law meant to protect public order and personal safety. But over time, it has turned into an anecdote that makes outsiders laugh. In Kentucky, locals joke that they protest in a very Southern way. If they dislike a sermon, they will quietly turn their backs, or at worst, shout a sarcastic hallelujah. But no one throws eggs like in a comedy film. What is worth noting is this: the law is still on the books. It has not been repealed. It has not been amended. It exists as a legal relic from a time when public debate could descend into chaos within seconds. And like many other laws in Kentucky, it was written not because something happened once, but because it happened often enough. Today, few people think about bringing eggs to a public speech, but the quiet presence of the eggs and tomatoes law remains a reminder that there was a time when disagreement in Kentucky required measures that extreme. Number 13. Everyone must bathe at least once a year. After public order was once protected by banning the throwing of eggs and tomatoes, Kentucky went a step further, intervening directly in the personal hygiene habits of its citizens. And this was not folklore, but something that was clearly written into law in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. According to legal records compiled in Kentucky's collections of weird laws around the late 1800s, when the state was still largely rural and sparsely populated, there existed a regulation requiring every citizen to bathe at least once within a year. This law emerged in the context of deadly outbreaks such as cholera, typhoid, and typhus, which swept through the United States in the latter half of the 19th century, at a time when the concept of personal hygiene was still extremely loose. Back then, bathing was far from easy. Many families in remote areas of Kentucky had no running water and relied on wells or streams. Harsh winters made bathing a luxury rather than a routine. As a result, lawmakers considered the requirement of bathing at least once a year to be a minimum standard to reduce the spread of disease, a public health measure that was remarkably progressive for its time. But as society entered the 20th century, especially after the 1920s when water systems expanded and hygiene awareness improved, the law began to feel comically outdated. Its dry wording, at least once a year, has made later readers unable to suppress a laugh. It sounds as if in Kentucky bathing twice a year would exceed legal standards, while going more than 365 days without a bath would technically make you a lawbreaker. Today, Kentuckians recount this story with a straight face. They note that fortunately there are no recorded cases of anyone being arrested after 1900 simply for failing to bathe. The law gradually faded into obscurity, never formally repealed, but no longer enforced, much like many other archaic regulations.
Even so, its very existence reveals a deeply Kentucky truth.
There was once a time when bodily cleanliness was considered serious enough to be written into law, complete with dates, wording, and mandatory force. And because of that, in this state's history, even the act of taking a bath was once a fully legitimate civic duty. Number 14. The no dueling oath at inauguration ceremonies. At the inauguration ceremonies of Kentucky officials, alongside the oath of loyalty to the Constitution, there exists a very unusual pledge. The incoming official must affirm that they have never participated in and will not participate in any gunfight or duel. No metaphor, no figurative language. This is duel in its historical sense. Two people, two pistols or swords, and only one allowed to walk away. This tradition dates back to the early 19th century when Kentucky was still a frontier of honor in a young America. At that time, dueling was not a rare criminal act, but a common way for the elite to settle disputes of honor. Politicians, lawyers, journalists, any of them might head to a riverbank or an empty field to end the matter. Kentucky paid for that culture in blood. A series of shocking duels forced the government to respond. In the 1891 Kentucky Constitution, the clause requiring officials to swear that they would not engage in dueling was written explicitly, intended to sever the link between political power and personal violence. Ironically, one of the figures most closely associated with this tradition was Henry Clay, the greatest Kentucky statesman of the 19th century. He had taken part in several duels earlier in his life, yet later became a strong advocate for ending the practice. In one oath, Clay acknowledged his past but declared that he would never repeat it, turning the pledge into a boundary between a wild era and a new age. Today, no one in Kentucky settles disputes with pistols at dawn. But the oath remains unchanged, recited at every inauguration as a ritual that is both solemn and steeped in historical irony. The people of the state understand that it is not an outdated relic, but a deliberately preserved memory. To them, the oath serves as a reminder that Kentucky was once turbulent enough to require writing into its constitution something that seems obvious. To be a leader, one must first learn to restrain one's own temper. And like many things here, a tradition that sounds strange to outsiders is regarded by Kentuckians as entirely normal. Number 15. Dumping dirty laundry water onto the street is prohibited. Before the 20th century, when Kentucky was still largely rural, with dirt roads, open ditches, and tightly clustered homes, laundry was not done in enclosed bathrooms as it is today. People washed blankets, clothes, and rags using wooden tubs and metal buckets, then quite conveniently threw the dirty water straight out in front of their houses. The smell of soap mixed with mud, grease, and waste quickly turned village roads into muddy channels, where flies, bacteria, and disease flourished. As a result, Kentucky was forced to do something very ordinary: write a law requiring residents to collect dirty water and dispose of it in designated places, rather than dumping it onto the street. The purpose was entirely practical: protect public hygiene, reduce disease, and prevent roads from becoming open sewers. But when read through modern eyes, the regulation suddenly becomes amusing in a distinctly Kentucky way. People like to joke that there was once a time when a woman, after finishing the laundry, had to stand at her gate and politely ask her neighbors, "Excuse me, where am I allowed to pour this water under the law?" As if even pouring water required social etiquette. Today, almost no one remembers exactly where this law sits in the books. No one has been fined for dumping laundry water into the street for decades, yet it is still recalled as an anecdote because it reveals a deeply Kentucky truth. Even the smallest everyday actions once required laws to maintain order. And so, from meat falling from the sky, alien encounters, monsters beneath railway bridges, all the way to a bucket of dirty laundry water, Kentucky closes its chain of stories in a way that cannot be mistaken. In this place, the bizarre is not an exception. It is history. And to the locals, all of it, no matter how unbelievable it may sound, once was, and still is, perfectly ordinary.